Musical artists, and especially bands, tend to change the sound over time. Now, the ones that I'll be talking about today are ones that had a sound that you're not typically used to hearing from that type of artist. And a lot of the times, these are from members that no longer exist. Sometimes they're from the producers. And maybe just sometimes it's because the artist decided to change. And I'm looking at you, Hootie. Most artists will have a great starting album to put themselves on the map. Now, and then by the second or third album, that tends to be their best selling work, and then afterwards it's just kind of up and downhill. And then you have some artists who will have a lot of great hits, but they're kind of evenly spread out throughout their discography. And then there's one album with two or great big hits. And then sometimes you just get other artists where they have one really great album, and then their other albums just, no matter how hard I try, I just can't like them. Now, I'm not saying they don't have other good songs, it's just the albums as a whole, I just don't really care too much for. Now, today's case, however, I'm going to talk about an artist who started out one way, and then changed shortly after in a different style, in a different genre almost. Now, one of the biggest artists to have a great example of this are the Beatles. The Beatles were well known as the 1960s rock and roll type sound, and then shortly after became a psychedelic band, and then they turned into a 70s soft, also hard rock type band, just within the span of their 6 years. And then perhaps there's also Slim Shady switching over to Eminem. It's still under the name Eminem, but he's kind of had his different change of his personality to his type of the mood of his music, to even like the sound of his voice. And then you just have decades of change of artists like Cher and then even Aerosmith. But where I want to get to today are the artists that are possibly lesser well-known changes. And one of those artists are Alice Cooper. And if you watch my previous video about Frank Zappa, I did mention that I wanted to talk about Alice Cooper. And today is that day. Alice Cooper's band started out with a nice blend of every huge 60s band at the time, with sounds coming from The Who, Beatles, and even Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd. And with a mix of all these bands, had a nice hard psychedelic outcome. Right here is his first album. I got this record actually as a steal. The guy that I bought it from kind of didn't have a clue how much this is worth. And right here you see Alice in the middle before he started putting on his makeup. And then Frank Zappa produced this album under his personal label at the time, Bizarre. And I picked up this box set from FYE, and it's all about that, all about his label. And the other DVD is about him and Captain Beefheart, which I might go over him later. Though this era is kind of different, it's really good and wacky, especially if you love that late 60s era of rock music. Now, things really changed when there was the chicken incident. And that's what kind of led him to the shock rock. That kind of was ever since that incident of him throwing the chicken out on stage and it getting shredded up. It's funny because he actually called Frank Zappa the next day and he says, hey, or I think Frank called him, if I'm not mistaken. And he said, hey man, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You are getting a lot of publicity. And so that's kind of what led Alice Cooper to be known about his shock rock. Next, I present Fleetwood Mac. Some people are familiarized with Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham in the band, and with most popular songs such as Landslide, Go Your Own Way, The Chain, so on and so forth. But really, before them, they didn't even start the band. Before Buckingham and Nicks were even in the picture, drummer Mick Fleetwood, bassist John McVie, guitarist Jeremy Spencer, and Peter Green started the band as a Southern Blues style band with their self-titled album, and it's remarkable. Peter Green came to write songs, and a well-known song as Black Magic Woman and Man of the World, which if you haven't had a chance to listen to Man of the World, I definitely give that a listen to if you're curious about this era of the band. By the early 70s, Peter and Jeremy left, and thus Buckingham and Nicks were finalized into play. Next up are the Now, the Beastie Boys are known on being that list of one of the best-selling rap artists of all time, and they've even changed and evolved on how we look at rap music today. Now, it's probably not going to be that big of a shock when I tell you that they started out as a punk rock band in the late 70s and the early 80s. Now, you can definitely hear the rock and rap mixture because it's still a band. They're just rapping inside it. That's definitely a lot of that alternative 90s rap rock style, like with Korn and Rage Against the Machine. And they've had a lot of inspiration from a lot of classic rock that made them start out as a punk rock band, but they never really took it seriously, and they found that they had a lot of potential into the rap music. And then when they become popular with the rap game in '95, they dropped Aglio e Olio to bring back what it was like before. And it was nice to see them go back to the roots with this. It wasn't really a commercial hit album. In fact, it's kind of like a tucked away album. But it was nice to see that they kind of went back to the roots, and it was also nice to see that they kind of were just having fun with it. They didn't care what came out of it because it wasn't like they are the Beastie Boys, you know. It's not like they were going to hide back down and not become big again. But it almost reminded me of how Nirvana was when Nirvana first started out. They didn't care what they sounded like. They just wanted to jam, have fun. And you could really tell they didn't care because the album is really only 11 minutes. The entire album, not just one song. An entire album is 11 minutes. I mean, that's not even one side on a record. And lastly, we have Journey, which we all know Journey as that late 70s, early 80s hair-defying mullet arena rock band. But before there was Steve Perry, for the most part, it started out as a funky prog rock that heavily defies that feel-good 70s hard rock Boston style music. And by Boston, I mean the band Boston, not Mark Wahlberg's accent. And it started off with Neil Schon and Greg Rowley from Santana, and members were going in and out by the second album. And it resulted with Robert Fleischman briefly doing leads, and then leaving by the time they found Steve Perry. Steve Perry was hired after Robert, leaving Greg to just stick to his keyboards and less on the lead vocals. Thus, the band shifted into what they're now known as that 80s hair mullet type ballad band, arena rock bands, really similar to REO Speedwagon. Which, I love the early part of this band with Steve Perry, but about the late 80s, with all the ballads, it just wasn't personally my favorite. Just Affinity was probably like the greatest album, and then after that, it was just, eh.
Uh-oh, here it goes, Joe. That's the part where I worry about it. You start running down the stairs.
So sometimes it's nice to dig out the roots of some of your favorite artists to kind of get something new out of something old. If you haven't noticed, that's pretty much what I really enjoy doing.